So hello, everybody. I see some people coming in. We're going to wait probably just a couple minutes till we get critical mass, and then we'll get started. Thank you. Hey, Lauren. Before we begin, did you want to say any words about the seminars or upcoming seminars?
Um, yeah, I mean, thanks everyone for coming. We've recently been doing a lot of promo, try and outreach about these seminars, and we've had a couple hundred people sign up um for our updates about them. So we're really excited about the speakers that we've invited, including Paulina, and I think yeah, we're just looking forward to having some great speakers and having some interesting conversations.
Indeed. Wonderful. Thank you for setting this up. Um, okay, I see the numbers of people coming in is kind of slowing down, so I think this might be a good point to start. So hi, everybody, and welcome to the EDF Economics Seminar series. We are lucky to have Professor Paulina Jaramillo with us today, who is a professor of engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University and co-director of the Open Energy Outlook Initiative at Carnegie Mellon. Paulina is also a fellow of the Scott Institute for Energy Innovation and Research at Carnegie Mellon and a research affiliate of the Kigali Collaborative Research Center. Professor Jaramillo was a coordinating lead author for IPCC's AR6 report and is a current member of the National Academy of Sciences Roundtable on Macroeconomic and Climate-Related Risks and Opportunities. So today, Professor Jaramillo will present a study investigating the role of hydrogen as a decarbonization strategy for the US iron and steel sector in the context of an economy-wide net zero CO2 emissions target. So we'll have the presentation. We'll follow the presentation with a Q&A. And if you haven't had a chance yet, please have a look at Paulina's long list of publications on a wide variety of topics, interesting and related to a lot of the work we're doing here at EDF. So I'll pass it along to you, Paulina, and I don't know if you have preferences in terms of questions during the presentation or being saved until the end.
Um, I guess at the end
Yeah,
might work better.
that makes sense. Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Okay. Um, Thank you for the invitation. So I'm presenting on the role of hydrogen in decarbonizing US and iron and steel. I'm giving the presentation, but the lead analyst, the person that did all of the modeling, is Katie Jordan, who recently completed her PhD here at EPP and she's now working, gone out to the world and is no longer around here. So she's really the lead modeler on this work, and I'm gonna try to do a good job presenting her work and representing all the work that she did over the last couple years. So just as background, the IPCC report that came out in 2022 recognizes or reported that limiting climate change to 1.5 or 2 degree targets above pre-industrial levels will require deep, sustained, and rapid reductions of emissions. So this is one of the figures from the report. In the red, it shows the trajectory of emissions given current commitments and policies that have been agreed on as part of the Paris Agreement. And the purple, green, and blue lines represent the emissions trajectories that will be needed to meet the 2 degree or 1.5 degree targets with different levels of overshoot. And so this figure shows clearly that there's an enormous gap between what we've committed to and what we will need to get to 2050 to limit the warming to these targets of the Paris Agreement. What this means for the US is that there has to be a drastic transformation of the energy system. In 2021, the US emitted 16.35 gigatons of CO2 equivalent, and most of these is from energy-related activities. So the EPA classifies the emissions from sectors, end-use sectors, transportation, electric power, industry, commercial, residential, and agriculture. But most of the emissions from transportation, electric power, industrial, and commercial and residential are energy-related emissions. There are some emissions from industry that are non-energy related, that are a result of chemical processes, but more than 80% of US emissions are energy-related emissions. And so this transformation, this is reaching the emission targets by 2050 will require an enormous transformation of the energy system. And so energy system optimization models are one tool that we use to help us inform what those transitions may look like. This is a schematic of the energy system as we represented in our energy system model. It includes information about all of the primary energy sources, conversion technologies to energy carriers, end-use technologies, and end-use energy services. And so on the end-use energy services, here we're talking not about energy demand, but the service for lighting or the service for space heating and space cooling. And then so in lighting, that means like lumen hours. So it's not, we're interested in the demand for the service, not necessarily the demand for energy associated with that service, because we want to understand what are the roles of different end-use technologies in meeting that service demand. So this is a very comprehensive model. We use the model, our model is called TEMOA. And it represents, we have the model, the US represented through 9 regions, and the economy, the energy economy is divided into 6 end-use sectors. So the end-use sectors are commercial, industrial, transportation, residential, electric, and fuel supply. And the demand for services in commercial, industrial, transportation, and residential, that's an exogenous input to the model. And so we have an assumption of what demand for lumen hours or ton kilometers of transportation services are going to look like in the next couple of decades, and then the system optimizes. So the way the system optimizes fuel use and technology deployments is we have all the information on capital costs, fixed and variable costs, emission activities, fuel efficiency of the different technologies, and it's a least cost optimization model. And what we get out of the model is fuel use, how much does it cost, which technologies are deployed. We track emissions of greenhouse gases, but we also track emissions from of the major criteria pollutants like NOx, SO2, and PM2.5. There are constraints, user-defined constraints. So for example, we constrain the model so that supply is higher or equal to demand, so that we actually meet the demand for energy services. Some resources are limited, so we have supply curves and how much biomass do we have available at what cost, and those are also user-defined constraints. So we have a full documentation of the model. The model and the database are open access and available through GitHub. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the model. I'm going to go straight to our focus today, which is iron and steel production. So in the US, iron and steel production accounts for 10% of industrial CO2 emissions and 95% of US metal production. So this is if anyone has gone to a steel mill, this is what the hot metal looks like. It's actually, if you haven't had a chance to go to a steel mill, it's actually a very good, cool field trip. I did that last year. In the US currently, the emissions from steel production are around 1,000 kilograms of CO2 per ton of steel produced. So the question is, how do we reduce these emissions so that we can get closer, so that the sector contributes to our net zero target? Before going into the details of the model and results, let's talk a little bit about how steel is produced. So blast furnaces and electric arc furnaces are the most common ways of producing steel. This is the schematic of a blast furnace with a basic oxygen furnace. So the blast furnace is where you put in coke and you use energy sources like coal or natural gas, and at very high temperatures, and get pig iron coming out, which then goes into a basic oxygen furnace. Oxygen is added, and what comes out from the basic oxygen furnace is the steel. Don't ask me about the chemistry of what goes on in here, because I can't answer too many questions about that. Oop, wrong way. There is also the electric arc furnace, and so that's here. Electric arc furnaces can rely on scrap metal, or they can rely on what is called direct reduced iron. And so the production of direct reduced iron is different than the blast furnace, in that it's a chemical reaction where you have the ore and you put in natural gas and reduce the iron to create the input to the electric arc furnace, where the melting and addition of the the steel process. And so what comes out from the electric arc furnace, it's crude steel. Right now, most electric arc furnaces, so in the US, 70% of steel is produced via electric arc furnaces. Most of it is using scrap steel, so it's a recycling process. Globally, the shares shift. Globally, 70% of steel is produced through the blast furnace and basic oxygen furnace process. Increasingly, there's interest in using hydrogen in steel production. And the way that works is that instead of using natural gas in the direct reduction process, you use hydrogen, and the hydrogen can be produced. The idea is that the hydrogen can be produced with green electricity, and so it's a low carbon process, and that can reduce the emissions from steel production. So this is where there's been a lot of interest in recent years, a lot of discussions about hydrogen for direct reduced iron production. And what we're trying to see is how that fits into the whole picture for decarbonization. Now, while there's been a lot of attention about hydrogen use, this is not the only pathway to decarbonizing steel. So other decarbonization options in steel include carbon capture on the blast furnace, carbon capture on the direct reduced iron production. So even if you use hydrogen, there's still some CO2 emissions from the direct reduced process. Increasing the scrap steel input to the electric arc furnace. And there's a newer process called molten oxide electrolysis, which is also a low carbon. And there's a company actually in the US that is starting that is deploying and starting the commercialization of this process. So there's been studies that have looked at these decarbonization options from specifically in steel, from the steel sector component, but few analyses model iron and steel in the context of the entire energy systems. And so when we think about the key pathways that can be available for for decarbonizing steel, we have electricity, hydrogen, carbon, and capture. But the iron and steel sector would be competing with other sectors and other end uses for the resources. And so we try to use an energy system model to account for this competitiveness. One of the challenges is that historically, the steel production process hasn't been well represented in these type of energy system models. And there are being some efforts on including these. So for example, the International Energy Agency has a model that has a good representation of the steel production process, but that model is on a global scope and particular attention to India and China. The other gap in the modeling work that has been done is that the Inflation Reduction Act was passed in 2022 and has implications for the entire energy system. And so understanding how the energy system and what happens in the steel sector is affected by the Inflation Reduction Act is a knowledge gap. So to fill these gaps, this presentation focuses on 3 questions. One is, how would the IRA provisions affect iron and steel decarbonization? What iron and steel decarbonization technologies contribute to least cost net zero emissions of the entire energy system? And then there might be, we wanted to, like, there's several different technologies and there may be constraints on their availability. So how does the availability of those technologies affect the pathways to decarbonizing, still within the goal of decarbonizing the entire energy system? So to answer with this question, we simulate 7 distinct net zero scenarios. And so I'm going to go through these a little bit. Our current policy scenario, so we have to have a baseline. So our baseline is the current policy scenario, which represents the provisions of current policies, including the IRA, but no new policies are added after the provisions of existing policies expire. And then we also model some scenarios where we reach net zero emissions by 2050. And within that net zero category, we create some constraints. So for example, the first scenario here is that there's no carbon capture and sequestration for the blast furnaces or for the direct reduced iron process. And then what happens if there is no carbon capture in the blast furnaces and molten oxide electrolysis is not available? And then what if you don't have any of those options? There's no carbon capture and there's no molten oxide electrolysis. We also looked at some scenarios where we say, what if we limit the scrap steel supply? While the expectation is that the supply in the US, we use a lot of scrap steel in the production process, and the expectation is that the supply might remain constant. What happens if we start competing with other countries for the steel supply, and so it limits our ability, versus a scenario where you have unlimited scrap steel supply? And then finally, because we're looking at the entire energy system, the model accounts for the possibility of carbon dioxide removals through some carbon dioxide removal technologies like direct air capture or bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration. And these CDR technologies basically serve as a backstop for the net zero, basically, to balance out residual emissions from hard to decarbonize sectors. So we're gonna look at some of the results. So we start with the current policy, and what we're showing here is annual steel production during the period of the analysis, which is 2020 to 2050, by production process. And so you see that we start with in 2020, most of our steel is from electric arc furnaces, with some blast furnaces and basic oxygen furnace. And as the provisions of the IRA start increasing, we start seeing these darker blue where there's some carbon capture sequestration deployment on the blast furnaces. And that continues in these periods. There's a little bit of deployments of direct reduced iron, but not substantial. And then after the IRA provisions expire, it actually, the model finds it more like cheaper to go back to using just the regular blast furnace without still using the scrap steel, but then going back to the blast furnace without CCS. So if we then limit to net zero, where all technologies are available, so there's no constraint on what technologies are available. Again, early on, you start seeing deployments of the blast furnace with CCS. Still a lot of electric arc furnace from steel because that technology is available and it's lower carbon. And then after the IRA, in this scenario, it's a net zero scenario where there's a binding constraint on emissions that have to reach net zero energy for the entire energy system. And so again, a lot of CCS or carbon capture in the blast furnace. Some natural gas-based direct reduced iron, but very little, almost no hydrogen direct reduced iron. And interestingly, we do see some molten oxide electrolysis later on. Instead of like that makes up, replaces some of the blast furnace with carbon capture. And so in this net zero scenario where we have parameterized all of the technologies and using the available cost and efficiency data for these technologies, we see very little hydrogen deployment. If we remove the availability of carbon capture and sequestration or molten oxide electrolysis, molten oxide electrolysis is still in its infancy. And while there is a company that's starting commercialization and piloting, it might not be effective. And carbon capture and sequestration, it's a lot of uncertainty about are we really going to get there? And so if we remove those technologies, that's where we start seeing the hydrogen direct reduced iron in an electric furnace. And this is again reaching a net zero constraint by 2050. Now, the reason there's earlier deployments, the deployments are delayed is that early on in this scenario, we do have carbon dioxide removal. So some of the emissions that remain can be compensated with carbon dioxide removal. If we remove if we now take, in this case, we are removing CCS from the blast furnace, but we still have CCS available for the natural gas reduced iron. And so this is a little bit of a limited constraint on carbon capture, not available in the blast furnace, but available for the electric arc furnace. Then the model chooses the natural gas direct reduced iron instead of the hydrogen pathway. So these are cumulative emissions from iron and steel across all scenarios. This is the current policy. The units are million metric tons of CO2 from the iron and steel sector. And these includes non-natural gas scope 1. So those are emissions that are occurring at the plants but are not related to energy consumption. And then we have hydrogen production and electricity production, emissions from electricity and hydrogen production. There's still a lot of natural gas use in all of these scenarios, so that's why you see the yellow. So this is for the iron and steel. Here we have what happens to the entire energy system. And so this is the baseline scenario on current policies. This is economy-wide CO2 emissions in 2050. So in the current policy scenario, there's no constraints, so there are positive emissions. In all of the other scenarios, we have constrained the emissions to get to net zero, so they all get to net zero with a lot of carbon dioxide removal, either through direct air capture or through bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration. And so this is the entire. Now the emissions from iron and steel are part of the pink industrial sector. So there's a slight reduction in industrial sector. Obviously, in this scenario where there's only very little back, like there's a constraint on back and there is no direct air capture, then you have to have higher reductions in the direct, like scope 1 reductions in other processes. But there's still substantial BECCS deployment, bioenergy. So the cumulative emissions over time are different. And that has implications for overshoot, right? We care about the time, like how much you emit earlier has implications for whether we overshoot the 1.5 degree target and have to come back. But in terms of changes between 2020 and 2050, they're all basically the same because they all have, all of the net zero targets have a net zero, like have to be net zero by 2050. So the reductions are pretty much the same. The percentage change in emissions. What changes is the abatement cost for iron and steel. So here what we see, if we ban carbon capture and sequestration, like carbon capture from these processes, the average CO2 abatement cost in the iron and steel sector increases by a factor of 7. So this analysis really shows that CCS, it seems to be the cheapest way of mitigating emissions from iron and steel, more so than hydrogen. And this is because we are accounting for competition for hydrogen resources. These scenarios actually do have a lot of hydrogen being used across the energy system, but most of that is being used in other sectors for the production of synthetic fuels, which are particularly important. If there is no direct air capture, then you really have to replace a lot of the liquid fuels with synthetic fuels, which are hydrogen-based, and then emissions from transport and other industrial processes is where, not emissions, hydrogen used for other industrial processes and transport are more substantial than for steel. And so this limited deployment that we see in the iron and steel sector is partly driven by competition for hydrogen from other sectors. We have something about cost and the differences in cost associated with these pathways. Most of the cost associated with the production of steel is the variable cost and the cost of scrap steel. So that's like the biggest like the biggest chunk, the gray colors. So that the differences in the cost of producing total present value discounted of producing iron and steel in the scenarios is not drastically different. Is lowest in a net zero scenario without any technology or resource availability constraints, because it's deploying it like in this scenario you have all the technology options, so it's the least cost. The other question we wanted to see is then, when does hydrogen start getting deployed or being used in the steel sector? So we look at what happens if there are subsidies on green hydrogen based steel. And so we looked at different scenarios of, like, this is a subsidy on green hydrogen based steel. So 100, if you produce a ton of hydrogen-based steel, the credit would be 100 to 400. And what we see is you need a really large, like very large subsidy for hydrogen-based steel so that pathway becomes the dominant pathway for low carbon steel production. And again, this has a lot to do with competition for resources, both electricity needed for hydrogen production and the demand for hydrogen from other sectors. So this work explores these different decarbonization pathways in the context of a target of energy system-wide emission reductions. And so what we find is, despite substantial attention on green hydrogen-based DRI, under the current assumptions and parameterization of the system, hydrogen is preferentially used elsewhere. Now, I highlighted here the US economy because we're working with collaborators in China and South Africa, where there's a lot of interest in green steel, and the results there are different. So we have figured out that one of the main differences in the results with South Africa, for example, is that the characterization of carbon storage potential and and the cost of carbon capture and sequestration for the US is very detailed. We actually have a lot of data on where underground geologic sequestration can happen, and we have a lot of resource potential for that. So even if we account for the cost of that CCS, we have a lot of it, whereas in South Africa, there's not. There isn't a characterization of that resource in their energy system model, so they don't see the same results. So I think that's important to keep in mind, that the results are very specific to the US and may be different in other places. And this is specifically because of the carbon capture availability. There might be policy efforts in the future that could change the landscape. You could argue that a green steel production tax credit could expand the deployment of hydrogen use in steel production, although the tax credit we find would have to be pretty high. But there might be other, if there's a substantial push for reduction in cost of the technologies or the availability of hydrogen. So one of the constraints in the model is that we have to build the power infrastructure to produce the hydrogen. And so you have competition for electricity, for other sectors. So it's a dynamic process where competition for both electricity and hydrogen really drive these results. That's my presentation. This is work part of the Open Energy Outlook initiative here at CMU, where we've been developing the TEMOA model and maintaining the database. The model is open source. The database is also open source. And we're actually working with some people on EDF on a model intercomparison project to compare TEMOA to other energy system models. So, okay.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Paulina.
I'm going to stop sharing so I can see faces.
Okay.
Yeah.
That sounds good. Thank you so much for the fascinating presentation. A lot of interesting insights, I'm sure, for all of us that work on hydrogen. I see Jamie Fine has a question in the chat. Jamie, do you want to come on camera to ask your question? Happy to read it out otherwise. So Jamie's question was, does your model allow for changes in demand for iron due to substitutes and innovation, or is iron demand held constant across scenarios?
Yeah, demand for iron and steel is constant. This is not a general equilibrium, like not a computational general equilibrium model. So it's more of a partial equilibrium where we do have supply, balance of supply, but demand is not responsive.
Okay, thank you. I'll pass it over to Matthias, and I'll just encourage anyone else to just raise their hand with questions, and we'll go in order.
Hi. Sorry, I've lost track of where I am in the screens. Okay. Thanks a lot. That was super interesting to see the options and the interaction between different options. I wondered, I mean, I think for one thing you were showing carbon direct removal ended up being kind of preferred over hydrogen for steel. And I wondered, do you have, I guess there were two sides to that. One was, I was wondering what cost you were using for carbon dioxide removal per ton. And then the other side of it was where you talked about competition for hydrogen. So I was wondering, is hydrogen coming from green electricity, or is it blue hydrogen? You know, I guess what were the sources, and were you up against sort of finite supply for that?
Yeah, so the model endogenously estimate production of hydrogen from the different pathways based on demand for the services. So the hydrogen pathways that we have represented include like blue hydrogen and green hydrogen. I think natural gas-based hydrogen, so brown hydrogen. And the model basically chooses, like in the least cost, when it balances that if you want to do green hydrogen, you also have to build additional electricity capacity. And so it endogenizes that decision. I don't think I have a figure here of what the sources of hydrogen. There's a lot from the overall results for the energy system. A lot of hydrogen actually comes in the optimizations comes from BECCS, because BECCS has the dual benefit of producing a product, but also removing carbon dioxide. Just to be clear, carbon dioxide removal is available to manage residual emissions from the entire energy system. And then but in terms of what it's choosing, what the model is choosing in the steel sector is not carbon dioxide removal, it's carbon capture from the blast furnaces or the direct reduced iron process. So it is choosing carbon capture at the facilities over hydrogen. There's still some carbon dioxide removal, but that's really more about residual emissions from the entire system.
Thanks.
Natasha?
Thank you. Really, really appreciated this presentation. I'm curious if you've spoken with industry groups at all about this research. And I ask because within the sort of climate movement of folks thinking about ways to decarbonize industry, if you talk about trying to decarbonize iron and steel, hydrogen is kind of the darling of the options. But I think very often if you approach the question from the angle of how do we fix this one problem, you're missing the broader context of the rest. I'm curious if you've seen any sort of reactions from the industry, if they're more sanguine about the potential for hydrogen, or if they're very excited around the incentives and the current structures that we have promoting it.
So I think one of the challenges is that the steel industry is a global industry. And actually most of steel production is outside of the US. And so when you look at what they're like, what our South African, and we have presented these results to, we have a consortium with several steel like an advisory board for a project with participation from major steel companies. And they are not particularly shocked that CCS, I actually don't think they were disappointed that carbon capture is an option. But I think that's very specific to the US. So I think the hydrogen interest really is in a global context. Hydrogen is probably a very good pathway outside of the US where carbon capture, and part of this is that we don't know, in other countries, we don't have as good a characterization of the availability to store for geologic sequestration of CO2. One of the things I'm working with our collaborators is we're writing a paper where we really compare our results to the results using a system and a model that is for South Africa and the China-based model to see those differences. and what's driving those differences. So I don't necessarily think that we should take these as hydrogen is not a feasible or an interesting or should not be the darling. I think it's just that this is going to be a location specific technology deployments. And so from a industrial, if I was if I was still making, I have to look beyond just the US. And so if hydrogen, then and selling there's all of the requirements for low carbon steel purchasing. And so in a global setting, they're probably not it's probably not wrong for them to look at hydrogen as a pathway. This is just I think it's an interesting result that brings some interesting questions, but we have to be cautious about how to use it.
And it sounds like it really comes down to that cost differential between availability of CCS versus DRI. So that's also interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Oleg.
Yep. Thank you, Paulina. Nice to see other than electric power sector studies for decarbonization. So I have several questions. One of them is, so what is the status of DRI based on hydrogen? I recall such discussions back in like early 2010s in China, but so what is the status? Are there any available on the market already, or it's still like perspective? This one, and I will list like what I have, so you don't have to answer all of them. So another one is regarding hydrogen costs and source. So my question was like, what is the share of intermittent renewables in your scenarios in electric power sector? Because higher share makes your hydrogen potentially cheaper and more available green hydrogen. This is what we learned in some studies for China again. Another one is, so the difference in costs is not that significant, like in final. So if we compare like 450, as I remember, like 500 something, it's like 10%, but it's like within a year fluctuation of steel costs. And if you look at the multi-year perspective, it will be times costs are changing. So what I see from your analysis, the changes of all scenarios, across scenarios in costs are not that dramatic. This is what I learned. And also this is like more like to modeling. So I see like your model is jumping from one technology to another. So what's happening with the technologies? Are they retiring or it's a different capacity utilization? Okay, I stop here. So if you reply some of them, it's great. Thank you.
Yeah, so on the status of the hydrogen-based DRI, there's a plant in Germany that is working on it, and they are piloting the process. They're starting with, so a lot of it is right now natural gas-based DRI, and they're starting to mix hydrogen. And I think there's a plant also in South Africa that is starting, but it's not a widely deployed technology, and there's a lot of uncertainty about the costs of the technology. So we kind of use the subsidies to look at, the subsidies can also be looked at if we can reduce the cost of the technology. That's another mechanism. The second question, so the model endogenously optimizes the deployment of electricity and estimates the cost. Like we don't give it a cost of hydrogen. I can show you from another presentation. So I'm going to show my screen. This is another presentation. Wait, what is it? Where did it go? What can you see like a slide?
Yeah.
Okay. So these are primary energy consumption in two scenarios. not like, and so they're the same basically scenarios. The current policies with the IRA and nothing else, and then the net zero scenario. In this one, all of the options. This is the equivalent to the least cost scenario that I showed, and so there is a lot of renewable in the net zero scenario. We get a lot of renewables, wind, solar, and also biomass. I guess biomass is a lot of the dual benefit of producing hydrogen and then also doing carbon dioxide removal. The model builds this capacity and operates the capacity based on a representation of the power system. So there is a lot of renewables in the net zero scenario in the power generation sector. Those are two questions. Oh, what's happening? There are some weird patterns where we see technologies being deployed and then stop using them. And this was like really odd to us. But like basically this is a least cost optimization. It's on a myopic formulation, so it doesn't know what's happening. Because of the way we represent the power system, we reach computational limits. So the optimization, there's no look ahead period. It only knows what's happening today in terms of constraints, doesn't know what's going to happen in 5 years from now. But when in 5 years from now, when it optimizes, it's still finding that it's lower cost to basically have low utilization of some of the resources that it built in previous years. So there is some decommissioning because of end of life happening during the period, but there's also just low utilization of some resources, because even accounting for the discounted costs of investing in that technology and operating the technology, still finding it cheaper in a present value, discounted present value sense.
Thank you. So we'll go to Maggie and then Lauren.
Hello, wait, trying to get my camera on. Oh, there we go. Thanks so much for the presentation. And this is kind of a rather specific question, I guess, based on the slide that you had gone through. You mentioned that iron and steel production is not the preferred use case for hydrogen with the current cost assumptions, and you said it was synthetic fuels and other industrial uses. And I was wondering if you can say a little bit more about what is in that second bucket of other industrial uses.
So the representation of other industrial uses is we've managed a good representation of iron and steel. For other industrial uses, it's still pretty rough, but what we characterize is different demands for heat. And so and I think we have 3 different temperature requirements for heat. And so it's using hydrogen for high temperature heat requirements in other industrial processes.
Lauren?
Hey, so I was wondering, you had all of these scenarios about subsidies for green hydrogen-based steel, and I was wondering, like, are you finding that those are increasing your system costs elsewhere? And is it increasing your system costs overall, like when you consider the sum of like electricity, other use costs, and steel costs?
So the subsidies are basically a cost reduction for iron and steel. So the reason it's choosing it, so the way we implement subsidies is like a negative cost for that pathway. And so it's deploying it because it's like at those subsidies, it's cheaper than the other. So the cost is not changing drastically, the direct cost in the model. However, there are costs to subsidizing, right? It's just a transfer, and the optimization does not account for the cost of the subsidies. So in the objective function, the costs are not changing because you reduce the cost enough that it becomes cost competitive, and so it gets similar optimum cost, but the optimization doesn't account for the cost of the subsidies, but that's basically a transfer of costs to the government. Does that make sense?
Got you. I guess what I was envisioning was that like if you subsidize hydrogen-based steel, you would crowd out the use of hydrogen for other uses. That doesn't happen.
It just builds more hydrogen and more, like, it
Okay,
just
so
builds the hydrogen infrastructure, right? It makes
Gotcha.
it worth to build additional infrastructure.
okay, interesting. I have another quick question. So like if most of the steel production is outside of the US, does the model consider that you can just import it?
We have a static demand, and so the demand for iron and steel is basically based on domestic production levels. So it's assuming that domestic production levels will, and so this comes from, we don't develop these demand estimates, they come from the publicly available data, and I have to look at the details of where the steel specific projections come from. But they basically assume a very static level of domestic production. And so the demand in the model is not actually demand for total steel in the US, it's like the demand that it's seeing is local production.
Yeah, for like net steel. Yeah, I wonder, like these electricity models are sort of meant to be like country-based because you don't trade electricity across countries, but you can trade steel, so it'd be really cool.
Yes.
if There are other
Yeah, so-
countries where you have like specific opportunities to produce a lot of steel and then you let countries trade.
Yeah, so first of all, this isn't an electricity model, this is an energy system-wide model. So it's not just the power sector. What you're talking about, it's a global, what you would need is a global general equilibrium model. And the
Yeah.
challenge with a general equilibrium model is that you lose the technical detail for the energy system. Like it's a trade-off. So there are some general equilibrium models to look at steel trade, which I guess we could think about how we couple those because those may become really important, and it may not actually be I think that's itself like a research project, how to couple, and it's been done in other contexts. It's just not being our focus as of yet.
Yeah, of course. They're just throwing it out there for this would be
Yeah,
cool.
Thank you. We had one more question from Jamie in the chat. Jamie, do you want to jump on to ask the question? Just because I saw you pop on for a second earlier. There he is.
Yeah, sorry, I had to step out of my office. Yeah, I'm looking at modeling over the next 25 years, and I saw these, different options for processes. I guess I just find myself wondering if we have allowed for game-changing innovation in the processes, or I had a colleague who used to always add to his presentations, well, what about wildebeests? What about wildebeest power? Just this idea that there's something out there, some innovator out there that's going to offer something that we modelers haven't thought of. And when you're looking at a 25-year time frame. But I don't know much about steel and iron production. Maybe there's no potential there. So I was just kind of wondering what your thoughts are on that. Thanks for your presentation.
I mean, my guess is, I think there's probably potential, like we get nuclear fusion, right? This changes the whole thing. That's just a challenge of energy system models. We cannot characterize what we don't know. The molten oxide electrolysis, as far as we know, is like the technology that is really out there at the edges. That could be, and we actually do see molten in some scenarios. We had to remove it from some scenarios because we actually did see it replacing competing with some of the hydrogen based. That technology, again, it's really early. So there is a company, I actually have a sample of steel produced with a molten oxide process. But they expect to have production, like commercial production, in the next 5 years. How that scales up is do they get it to a really low cost? So those are things that could happen. They're just really hard to characterize in these models.
A follow-up question, and apologies for the noise. I'm curious, and I posted it in the chat earlier, maybe you already answered it when I was stepping away from my desk. When you model iron and steel production, do you allow for changes in demand through innovation or substitutes? Is that
Yeah.
something that's even viable in this context? Thanks.
Not in this. So this model does not include elasticities of demand. So it does not have price elasticity of demand or substitution, elasticity for substitution. That again, that would be a general equilibrium model. And there are some general equilibrium models. You just lose detailed representation of energy system, like of energy technologies, right? We have like this tool has 80,000, like the database includes a characterization for 80,000 processes, energy conversion processes. So you can't have that level of detail when you have a general equilibrium model. What we could do is look at exogenously develop different models, different scenarios for demand and see that could be like an iterative process where you get, yeah, but that would be outside of the model.
Lauren?
Yeah, I guess final question. I was wondering, if you've generated any like broad policy implications from this work.
From this specific work or from the overall and open energy outlook work?
I was thinking from this specific work, but really anything you'd like to share.
Yeah, so from this work, we're working on the paper and we're really struggling with like this is a very US context specific. And so what does this mean in the global market? For the open energy outlook, we're actually releasing our second report this week during Energy Week. We submitted comments for the hydrogen tax credits. So we have done some analysis to do some policy analysis, and we submitted comments for the Treasury Department hydrogen tax credits rulemaking. And you can find our comments in our website. So we are using them in that type of context.
Thank you. I might sneak in one very quick last one, if that's okay. So one of the sort of questions we're wrestling with often, particularly in the case of residential heating, is the fact that the 45V hydrogen tax credit kind of introduces this subsidy, which distorts the competitiveness with electrification, and so introduces hydrogen in settings and makes it more competitive when you wouldn't necessarily want that. So in this case, like blending hydrogen into natural gas systems for heating. And, we've been doing some analysis to kind of like think about if you had a comparable subsidy for, on electricity rates to kind of level that playing field, what does the economics of it look like? So I'm just wondering generally in the context of like the supply chain or the production process, if there's like other places where cheaper electricity could kind of displace emissions, or like natural gas use, because I saw that that's used in other parts of electric arc furnaces.
So hold on, something happened. Ooh, I was just about to look at something
No problem.
at a figure somewhere else. So the Inflation Reduction Act does include subsidies for for electrification in the residential and commercial sector. Okay. And so we see like in our model results for the entire system, we actually don't see much hydrogen being deployed for buildings. For buildings, we see a lot of electrification of water heating and we see a lot of heat pump deployments.
Yeah. Just to clarify, like that's something where we hear a lot from industry about just kind of wanting to blend hydrogen into distribution networks and systems.
So
but
you hear that from the hydrogen industry?
Utilities, just so that the infrastructure for natural gas can kind of continue to be used and benefit from
Right.
cities, so that
Yeah,
But-
so from a least cost of the like system-wide perspective, we don't see hydrogen, like the model doesn't see hydrogen being used in buildings. From a what we have here, right? One of the things these models is that you have a single planner with total decision-making power, which is not how the real world works. And so the behavior of firms, and there are other costs, right? They don't have cost of retrofitting natural gas pipelines. We have cost of building, we have the cost of transport of hydrogen via pipelines, but it's not necessarily through, like, we're not representing detailed retrofitting of natural gas pipelines. So, and again, I think one of the values of these models is you do see that sectoral competition. And so from a producer perspective or from a natural gas utility perspective, you might see a value proposition there. But in that case, you're not looking at competition for electricity to generate your hydrogen, right? You're just thinking, and I don't know if you saw, I think this idea of competition for electricity is going to become more relevant. Like there was an article in the New York Times last week about demand for electricity increasing, and it seemed like the article seemed to suggest that it was surprising that demand for electricity was increasing after having been flat for a decade. And my response was, well, yeah, because we are electrifying things. Like we are electrifying we're doing electrifying transportation. So demand for electricity is gonna keep increasing. This should not be surprising, but it seemed like it was a surprising finding. And so I think the realization of we're talking about a massive expansion of demand for electricity, and you're gonna have you're gonna start seeing competition for that. And like, can we really even build that much capacity? So will the electricity capacity be available to produce the hydrogen when we can build transmission lines in this country?
Yeah. All big questions. And so yeah, so we're past time. I'm sorry, I went over time with that last question. So I just want to please join me, everybody, in thanking Dr. Jaramillo for presenting today. We look forward to keeping in touch and seeing the evolution of this work, particularly with the international angle as well. So thanks again for joining us and for presenting today.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
so much.
I hope it was useful.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.